Hi everyone, and welcome to another video. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional photographer in Eastern Canada. Today I'm going to do a walkthrough of several of my favorite images. I'm going to be talking about the settings, the scenarios, and how I got the shot, also what equipment I used. These are indeed the images in my 2023 calendar, so while this is a little bit of a plug about my calendar, I figured I'd give you a little bit of extra value in the conversation by explaining how I got the shot, what equipment I used, what settings I used, and also the scenario that allowed me to get the shot. Hopefully from this conversation, you can get some tips, get some ideas, and help you go out and get your own top line photos, maybe for your own calendar someday. So let's get started. If we have a look at the month of January, I have a bald eagle that I photographed here in Nova Scotia. I was using my 5D Mark IV and my 500mm f4 lens with a 2x teleconverter, which is actually something I don't do very often. You can use the 2x teleconverter for great results if you have a very stable base. In this case, I was shooting from my car using a bean bag draped over the door of the open window. And the reason I was using a 2x teleconverter was the ground here was some cornfield stubble with some snow and some mud. It wasn't particularly photogenic, so I decided to try to take some tight portraits and some tight crops. So I put a 2x teleconverter on my 500mm lens, shooting it at 1000mm. I stopped it down to f10 for a little bit of extra sharpness, especially if I'm going to be cropping in. This is ISO 800 at 1/1000th of a second, and this is using my 5D Mark IV. That was what I was using before I used a Canon R5 and Canon R6. If you're looking for a great way to get into full frame for the first time and the Canon R5 and R6 are a little bit pricey for you, a used 5D Mark IV, they're steel these days and they're absolutely fantastic camera with a great autofocus system and a great sensor. So that's a shot. This bald eagle was flying in the air, and I was taking some very tight shots, some tight crops, and I just cropped it here so that the head was kind of along the lines of the rule of thirds, and I just like the wing position and some of the details in the wing, and I like the clean background in it. So that's my January bald eagle. If we look at the month of February, here I have a photo of a big crashing wave. This is in Wreck Cove, which is right next to Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia. You may have heard of Peggy's Cove. We have a very famous lighthouse. I'm actually shooting this from the parking lot of Peggy's Cove Lighthouse, shooting about a kilometer away. So I'm doing landscape photography with a 500mm lens and a 1.4 teleconverter. So I shoot this at 700mm and cropped. So like I say, I'm almost a kilometer away. The conditions were magical this morning. We had had a storm the day before and there was some leftover swell and heavy wave action, but the sun was coming up on a clear sky right behind this wave. I think it was off to the right. And because of that, it was putting a beautiful glow on the crashing waves. It was lighting up the sea spray in the background that was turning yellow, but the foreground was still in the shade because the sun wasn't high enough yet, and putting it, making a nice blue shade in the foreground. This was a great photo. I took a few thousand photos that morning. I just kept the shutter down and just kept taking photos and photos and photos of all the different waves as they were crashing. This was shot at 1/800th of a second. Shooting wave action, this is usually enough shutter speed, 1/640th, 1/800th, 1/1000th. Sometimes you want to shoot it a little bit less than the freezing speed to leave a little bit of motion in the wave captured in the photo. So try experimenting waves at 1/500th of a second, 1/640th, maybe a little bit less than actually freezing them. That way you get a little bit of motion in the wave. So this was at ISO 200, very low ISO, because I was shooting into the sun basically for this shot, using my R5 and my 500mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter. I love shooting waves if you can find a way of shooting them without getting wet in all the spray, because you usually want to be shooting them as the winds are coming from offshore to onshore. It can get pretty wet, so having something to put over your lens to keep it dry is usually a good idea. My image for March is this blue jay, and this was shot actually right in my backyard. This is an example of a shot that you don't need a big 500mm f4 lens. This is using the Canon 100-400 version 2 on my 5D Mark IV, and I just put some sunflower seeds on the rail of my deck. I positioned myself to make sure I had some beautiful colors in the background, and I had a nice clean background. And this is ISO 800, 1/320th of a second. Actually, that's quite low, but when I want to crop and get lots of detail, I keep my shutter speed a bit on the low side to make sure that my ISO is low and I can get some really, really nice clean photos. And this is shot at f6.3, which is stopped down just a little bit on my 100 to 400. I find that adds just a little bit of extra sharpness when shooting with my full frame camera. And I just kept shooting as these blue jays came in, and they would make funny motions and funny moves, and this one gave me a funny look. And I didn't know I'd captured this look actually until I looked at my photos afterwards, and I was really happy that I did. This is a really cute photo, and I love the look that the bird is giving me. For the month of April, I have this beautiful Bohemian waxwing. So this is a bird that we get here in winter in Nova Scotia. We have cedar waxwings all year long, but Bohemian waxwings usually show up here in wintertime. They amass in great big flocks and go devour berry bushes. So if you can find one, you can usually find 50 or 100. They're tons of fun to watch as they devour berries. They come in huge flocks. They're usually pretty tolerant of people. So I was actually using my R5 and my 500mm lens without a teleconverter because I was so close. I used f4.5. The lens can be shot at f4, but when I was this close at f4, sometimes the depth of field is so thin that you don't always get the shot in focus the way you want, so I stopped it down to f4.5. I was shooting at 1/2500th of a second because these birds are picking off berries and they're flipping them in the air and moving around quite quickly. So you want a fair bit of shutter speed to be shooting something like this. It was ISO 5000 though, because I was shooting in the shade. It was a little bit dark, but this morning was amazing. I had 50 or 100 birds right in front of me eating away with these berries, and I shot a few thousand photos. I shot for 2 or 3 hours handheld with my 500mm lens. My arm was quite a bit tired afterwards, but I've still got 100 images on my computer that are worth posting on Facebook, Instagram, or printing as prints that I haven't even ever posted yet. I had that many photos of these great birds, sometimes alone, sometimes 2 or 3 birds in a shot, and it was great. I had a wonderful morning that day. And that morning as well, before this, I got to shoot some red-winged blackbirds with their breath while they were singing. So this was an amazing day when I got so many keeper shots. For the month of May, I've got this common loon, and he's got a green crab for a snack. And this was shot with my Canon 5D Mark IV and my 500mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, which is often how I shoot it. Around here, the birds are often not very tame. They're quite far away. I'm often cropping photos, and that 1.4 teleconverter on this lens is really still very sharp and helps me get a little bit of reach. I shot this at f6.3, which is unusual. I usually shoot that with that 1.4 teleconverter wide open at f5.6, but I think the birds were a little bit closer earlier, and I'd stopped it down a little bit. 1/800th of a second and ISO 1600. So 1/800th of a second is just barely enough to capture this flipping action. So basically a lot of seabirds like loons and eiders and grebes will catch food, but then they'll flip it several times to get it in a proper orientation before swallowing it. And what my technique is as they do these flips, I fire off bursts of photos. So they'll usually flip the food 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and every time they flip it, I'll take 3 or 4 shots in quick bursts. And then when you go home and go through your photos, you look for these surprises where, for example, the crab was evenly positioned between both parts of its bill and got a nice clean shot. And I'm really happy with this one. For the month of June, we've got this belted kingfisher. I was observing this belted kingfisher at a local pond, going back and forth from this post to diving for food and then coming back to the post, and diving for food and coming back to the post. So I positioned myself to get ready for one of these times that the bird was coming into the post. I shot this with my Canon R5, my 500mm f4 lens and a 1.4 teleconverter, 1/2000th of a second, f5.6, and this is ISO 5000, so there wasn't a ton of light that day. But what I did was I pre-focused my camera on the post, that way getting ready to get the focus on the bird as soon as it showed up. So I pre-focused on the post, and I think I used eye auto detect on this one. And when the bird came in, I just aimed a little bit to the right of the post as it was coming in. It locked onto the bird, and I just fired a bunch of shots as it came into land on this little this stick. The shot right before landing with the wings wide open is what I thought was the best looking shot of the bunch. For the month of July, one of my favorite shots this year, and this is a shot of a red-winged blackbird with its breath as it's singing. This is actually the first YouTube video I ever made. If you go onto my playlist and look at the behind the scenes playlist, the first video I ever made on YouTube was how I captured this shot. And I actually teach you how to get the shot yourself. What are the winning conditions for getting this shot? I shot this with a Canon R5, my 500mm lens, and a 1.4 teleconverter. I shot this at 1/2000th of a second. f5.6 at ISO 1600. 1/2000th of a second seems like quite a bit, actually. My experience is on these breath shots, if you shoot them at 1/1000th or less, you don't get the crisp little tendrils and little lines in the breath. So I tend to shoot this with quite a high shutter speed, more than one would think, and that seems to work out well. This was tons of fun getting a shot like this. In the month of August, I shot this beautiful photo of a piping plover. And I also have a YouTube video on this as well, how I got this shot. And basically this is my Canon R5, my 500mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, shot at 1/1000th of a second, f5.6, which is wide open, at ISO 100 actually. I was kind of shooting backlit a little bit into the sun. But of course shooting backlit is what makes this shot work, because it gives you the glow of the backlighting of the fuzz and the feathers around the piping plover chick. So that's what kind of makes a shot. For these shots with birds or animals that have a bit of fluff or fur, like foxes or chicks of birds, you want to shoot them, if you can, a little bit backlit. And the backlighting, especially against a dark background, will really make the outside of your subject glow and can really make for a great shot. I will put a link on how to get the calendar if you're interested down in the description below. You can get it on my secure website. Shipping in Canada and the US are free, and for international clients, if you want to order 5 or more, I can arrange a custom shipping rate. I sent 7 of these to New Zealand last year. For the month of September, I have this red fox kit. Shooting red foxes is something I really enjoy doing, and shooting kits when they're still cute and curious is of course lots of fun. This is with my R5 and my 500mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, shot at f5.6, which is wide open. It was getting pretty dark at this point though. I shot this at 1/250th of a second, which is less than I usually use to shoot targets like this, but my ISO is at 6400 already, so I didn't want to go any higher. So when my ISO, I shoot with auto ISO often. When my ISO starts creeping up there, I start usually bringing down the shutter speed. At this point is the right time to take off the teleconverter as well, because you're losing a stop of light. So really at this point, I should have been taking off my teleconverter, shooting again at f4, and that would have dropped my ISO to half of 6400, which would have been 3200. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Teleconverters are best used when there's a fair bit of light. When you're shooting very early morning, late at night, it's time to take off the teleconverter and really keep your image clean rather than getting more reach. This is the cover image on my calendar, and one of my favorite photos of the year. This is a snowy owl shot here in Nova Scotia, Canada. This is shot with a Canon R5, my 500mm lens without the teleconverter, shot at f4.5. As I mentioned earlier, natively it's f4, but sometimes I'll stop it down to f4.5 or f5, just to stop it down a little bit if I'm close enough to my target, because I want a little bit more depth of field, a little bit more in focus. This was shot at 1/2000th of a second and ISO 3200. Now for shooting an owl flying gently by, 1/2000th of a second shutter speed is probably more than you need, but my experience is when birds are taking off, you need more shutter speed because they flap their wings more quickly and move more vigorously than when they're just gliding by. So this bird had been sitting there for 10 or 15 minutes, the sun was setting, and I was getting pretty sure that this bird would leave at sunset to go hunting. So I hid myself between some rocks and just waited out a few minutes for the sun to set when it would take off. What I also did was I experimented by moving sideways a bit. The sun was just off to the right. When I moved a little bit to the left, there was too much backlighting and the whole photo just got washed out in golden color, but really washed out. So I moved a little bit farther to the right, but when I got too farther to the right, I lost the backlighting and I lost the beautiful color. So when it comes to shooting backlit subjects, try moving left or right backwards a bit to get the backlighting at the right angle. In my experience, backlighting at between 10, 15 to 30% backlit is where you want the sun. Getting the sun directly behind your target, I find, kind of overwashes the photo with golden light, which is pretty in a way, but you really don't get enough subject detail. And if you move more than 40 degrees offside for the backlit sun, you lose the color. So that's something you need to experiment with. And if you're getting ready for a bird to take off, make sure you've got a little bit of extra shutter speed over what you think. And as a bird photography tip, this bird did something that large birds often do right before taking off. He pooped. And that's a real bird photography tip. Large birds, especially like ospreys, for example, if they poop, it means they're getting ready to go. So if you see a bird poop, make sure you've got enough shutter speed ready for the flight shot. Also, they'll take off into the wind. So if you can set yourself up with the wind a little bit your back and backlit, there's a really good chance that when they take off, they'll take off in your direction, which of course makes for a much better photo. For the month of November, I've got a wood duck, which is really one of our prettiest ducks that we have here. And another example that you don't need a big fancy lens to get a good photo. This was shot with my Canon 5D Mark IV with my 100 to 400 lens, Mark II. That's a great lens for going to local duck ponds when the action's going to be quite close. And we had a few wood ducks and some other ducks in a local pond. It was snowing a bit, which I love getting snow or some kind of environment on my targets. And this was shot at f5.6 at 1/500th of a second and shot at 235 millimeters. So this guy was pretty close. He was really curious. I just laid down on the beach and he would come around. Now, somehow I've got a grumpy look. I don't think that birds can actually have facial expressions, but I love the grumpy look and the snow and the pose. And of course, it's a beautiful photo with the snow on the bird. So it makes for a really, really pretty photo. And my photo for the month of December is this northern pintail. This is shot with my 5D Mark IV, my 500mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter at f7.1. So I was fairly close to this bird, and when you're really close, your depth of field gets even thinner. So if you want to have a greater proportion of the bird in focus, you need to stop down a little bit. So I'll stop down to f7.1. I shot this at 1/640th of a second and ISO 1600. So this is another tip. Preening birds are just tons of fun to shoot, and they can give you all kinds of neat poses. So this bird was preening, cleaning its feathers, rearranging its feathers. When I see a bird preening, I just sit there and I shoot. And you never know whether or not you're gonna get an interesting pose, an interesting look, have a big long feather from its wing in its bill. There's all kinds of neat scenarios that can flow from shooting these birds while they're preening. So when you see bird preening, get yourself in the angle where you got the background that you like, and just sit there and take tons of photos as they preen. When you get home, you might get some kind of nice surprise. And that's it. That's the 12 photos in my 2023 calendar. Thanks very much for joining me. I will put a link on how to get the calendar if you're interested down in the description below. Thanks very much for joining me. I hope you got some tips to go out and get your own really nice photos, and maybe in the future you'll make your own calendar. I really hope that you do. Thanks very much for joining me.